The Battlehosts. Be a better gamer, build a better community.
Welcome to Battlehosts, a podcast and website dedicated to helping you become a better 40K gamer and to build a better community of players. I'm your host, Mark, and with me tonight is Matt.
Hello.
This podcast is part of a series of podcasts on the new edition of Warhammer 40K. With the release of the new edition, we are doing these special mini episodes, each one covering a different aspect of the new edition. In this particular episode, we're going to talk about the new rules for terrain in Warhammer 40K.
It's the big one.
Yeah, this is the big one. This is the one that we talked about all through 8th, that we liked 8th, but man, they need some terrain rules. They really needed some terrain rules, and now we have it.
Yeah, we haven't had terrain rules in a while, and it's going to be really, really awesome to have, a big, robust set of terrain rules instead of, the one page that we've got in the past few editions.
Yeah. Well, and flexible too. But with all of that, so we're going to do our best to go through every single one of the rules a little bit and kind of talk about different situations. But know that it's going to take a while to kind of really wrap your head around these things. And we've played a couple games, socially distanced, of course, and we're still sort of trying to wrap our head around what does a ideal board layout look like? Like what is a good sort of setup of different terrain features? And so we'll talk about that toward the end, but it's going to take a while to figure all this out. Yeah,
again, just to echo, it is the biggest change to the game from 8th to 9th ed, bar none, not even close.
Yeah. So some of these updates were pretty minor changes that actually had pretty big impact on gameplay, as we've talked in the other mini episodes. But the terrain feature is like you said, it's the most extensive set of rules, which is fitting because we just didn't have them in 8th edition. So be sure to check out all our mini episodes so you know all the changes with this edition. We have 2 more after this, and then we'll be ready for the launch of the new edition of 40K. Okay, terrain rules. The terrain rules are basically, in 8th edition, basically they said, here's a manufactorum, here's this terrain kit that Games Workshop sells, which looks like a ruin. Here are the rules it has. And the rules was basically +1 save. That was really it. Right? That was essentially it. And they had here's the statuary, and the statuary provides a leadership buff. And so they weren't rules that you could apply to the kind of terrain most people have in their homes. Most people don't have Games Workshop terrain. Unless you have a lot of money, and because their terrain is pretty expensive. And if you're a TO, you're running big events, you usually go with more MDF terrain areas and stuff like that. So
you don't have the money, or you don't have the patience, because some of those old GW terrain kits were ungodly frustrating to put together.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the new Kill Team terrain. The new Kill Team terrain is just awesome. Yeah. It goes together so easily, and even some of their industrial terrain, the walkways, is quite easy to put together. But the old Basilica, the old Manufactorum, the old that set that came in the big box where it had all the terrain in there. Like the walls didn't always line up, and there was extra pieces, and you didn't know where they went.
Yeah, there was just a lot of detail too. Most people didn't take the time to paint all that stuff. It's just a ton of stuff to paint too. So
and do you remember the first Void Shield generator? Like for that brief second that they made the Void Shield generator, it was resin. That was a huge chunk of resin.
I remember that. It was a run on those things.
Yeah, it was very limited, and it was a badge of honor to have the old Void Shield generator. I got one of the limited sets. It's made of resin, and it's awful to put together and nearly impossible, but I have one of the old Void Shield generators. Yeah.
For sure. But I think though that the rules now are basically that's it. You can take any piece of terrain that you own. It doesn't really even matter what it is, and you can apply some rules to it. And so that's what I mean by it being super flexible. The first thing you do is you categorize it. The second thing you do is you give it traits. And between those two things, you can take anything and make terrain have some kind of an impact in the game. So
and they had some of this in 8th, not a lot. You could count on one hand really how much they actually defined. Nobody ever remembered it because it was so few. Craters in 8th, that was naturally a -2 to charge if you went through any sort of crater. If anything was identified as a crater, forests were exactly the same thing. You got a negative charge, but nobody really remembered those rules because most of them were irrelevant and didn't come into play during the game. But they really took a left-hand turn with that to the point where some might argue that there is a lot to remember in this terrain section that we're about to go over.
Yeah. And I think what's probably going to happen, tournament organizers, I mean, you know, they're basically going to pick 2 or 3 different types of terrain and kind of build around that. So I don't think you're going to want to have super unique tables unless it's just going to be kind of tricky. But I think you'll see more standardized types of boards with certain kinds of terrain that you're going to see. You're almost always going to see ruins, for example. Ruins is sort of the classic 40K terrain. And, you know, you can do a lot of stuff with ruins. You can make it look like a jungle-themed ruin. Aaron, with the Boise Cup, he has a Tyranid, like, infestation for ruins. I mean, you can do a lot with it, but for the most part, there's still just these ruined buildings. I don't think those are going away anytime soon. Yeah,
and I'm going to get into it a little bit later when we talked about, you know, that topic of, you know, being able to have a themed table that is also functional, because in the past 3 editions you've had to kind of make a choice on which way you wanted to go with your tables, especially at tournaments. Did you want them to be functional, a la Nova, where they had 2 large shaped L's in the middle of the table, 2 craters, 2 ruins, and two other like forest type structures in other corners? None of them necessarily looked wonderful or thematic because they were mass produced, but they were extremely functional and worked so well in the tournament environment. But then you'd go to tournaments like the Boise Cup, where you'd have these wonderfully themed tables by Aaron, you know, Captain A. Like there was a Star Wars table that was on the theme. The bummer part of that whole thing was that there were really cool ideas for themed tables that Aaron had, and we'd test out, we'd play on them, and we'd say, Aaron, this doesn't work. Like, he had an indoor table that was really cool. It was a really cool indoor table. And of course, like Endor, it had a bunch of trees. And, you know, Michael Snyder and I were playing on it, and we were telling him, like, no, this isn't going to work just functionally. But now with 9th edition, you can give a lot of these sets of trees different rules, like obscuring, that make them both thematic and functional. Which is great. You get the best of both worlds.
Yep, for sure. And that's the exciting thing about. I'm in some ways, if Boise Cup had happened, it would have been the end of June, and it would have been probably, if history is any indication, if we had not gone through all of this, you figure 40K probably would have dropped just before. The scramble to figure out the terrain rules would have been, it would have been very difficult to figure out the best way to lay out those and apply those rules to that themed terrain that he has. Because, you know, so much of the changes, you know, you make, like you said, we test those tables like locally, and he makes all these changes, and eventually the tables looked a lot like, they had the same function as a tournament table, but you kind of lose something. You lose some of the theme there when you have to add in lots of stuff just to make it feel more like a quote-unquote functional table.
And I mean, I might be jumping ahead a bit, but I like you said, I just imagine that when we go to tournaments now, or you go to play games at your local game store, there should probably or will probably be some sort of flash card or some sort of laminated card on each table that identifies what each piece of terrain is.
Yep, for sure. Yeah. So that is the thing, is that before we could ignore all the terrain except for the ruins that gave you a +1 save. Now you can't. You're going to have to actually know some of these rules, and I think that's okay. I think it's okay. People will learn the basics here, but let's get into it. So that the first thing is, there's a category of terrain, and there are 4 categories. The first one is a hill. And the hill is basically just a part of the battlefield, and you use it for movement and for visibility, for line of sight blocking. A hill doesn't provide there's no rules, you can't apply a trait to it. It's just simply a hill. In the past, if you wanted to have something and you called it area terrain, you can do that, but this is not what the hill is. A hill is essentially just a chunk of something in the battlefield that provides line of sight and also slows movement down, because you have to go up and over these things. So it's just a hill. That's just really it.
Yep. Just a hill. It's been around probably Probably since 3rd edition.
Yeah, and I'm trying to, we have some hills that are really big hills, like you can almost hide a knight behind. That's really almost the best way. If you put it kind of in the middle or off to the side, then it really just blocks off chunks of the battlefield. I'm going to have to play around with that, to see the best way to use hills. Because I think for the most part, hills just seem kind of slowing movement down. They almost kind of get in the way. So we'll have to see the best usage of hills. Maybe it's there to provide a little bit of color to a battlefield, but we're not sure yet.
Yeah, I mean, the primary function of a hill is to provide, like you said, you can move over it freely. Mm-hmm. There's no movement penalties, but it's just blocks line of sight. Mm-hmm. That's all it really does.
Yep, for sure. Okay, so obstacles. Obstacles are barricades, ruined walls, or other battlefield debris. So think of the things that you see in a lot of like kill team. A lot of the kill team terrain kind of is those little like half walls that are kind of ruined, or pipes or barricades, or any of those kinds of things you sort of see. Those are considered obstacles. And an obstacle, basically, infantry, beast, or swarm models receive the benefits of cover while it is within 3 inches of the terrain feature. Now, when it says benefits of cover, that just simply means that if it has a cover rule, it will get those benefits. And we'll talk about the cover rules because that is a trait that you can apply. But essentially, an obstacle is something that you have to move up and over. There are normal rules for movement, and you can't attack an obstacle, and infantry, beasts, and swarm models can receive cover where they're within 3 inches. So that's kind of the cool thing, is an obstacle is thematically it's like a jersey barrier, like a barrier that you can hide behind, and you can put kind of a squad behind it and get cover. These are things that you sort of see as battlefield debris that's just kind of scattered around, but I think we could do a lot of fun things with obstacles, especially for infantry units in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it gives rules to something that are on all of our tables anyways.
Yeah, for sure. And if it's over 1 inch, you have to walk up and over them. So area terrain, this is the one that most things are going to fall in. Area terrain has a footprint. What is that footprint? Well, the footprint is defined, however you define that footprint is area terrain. So we used to have to do it before anyways, but if you put a ruin down, and if you didn't have like a base around it, or like a platform, or like a piece of thin wood that you can kind of set it on, if the building basically just touched the mat, it doesn't really have a footprint, and you have to define it. Sometimes people would say, okay, where are the edges of this? Can you draw a line between these two corners? Is that considered part of it? So you have to define the footprint of area terrain. So it always has some thing that it occupies space on the map.
Yeah, it's one of those shorthand terms that has been used probably, I don't know, forever since I've been playing, and even in 8th and 7th as well, when you were defining terrain with your opponent, like, oh, well, what is this thing right here? Like, oh, we'll just call it area terrain. And area terrain was nowhere in the book for 7th and 8th, but we all knew what area terrain meant. It means if you're an infantry model, or you're on it, you get the benefit of cover.
Yeah, and in 7th edition, it was you get a cover save. In 8th edition, it was +1 to your save. So now, essentially, it is not even defining whether it doesn't even provide cover. It's just simply you have to be, essentially, if you're on it, then you get the benefit of whatever that thing is. So it has a footprint, and infantry, beast, swarms receive the benefit of cover while they're within it. So you have to be within it. Then you have buildings, and buildings are essentially the stuff that you purchase with points for your army. So these are the things, they're units. They're not terrain features. So it goes out of its way to describe the fact that a building is something that you spend points on, like the Eldar Warp Gate, or the Noctilus Crown, or the Mech Boy Workshop, or whatever your army has. It's essentially a building, and it's part of it's just a fortification. It's classified as a building. So it has its own rules. It's all part of its own data slate, and it is existing here because they want to basically make it, okay, it is different than the rest of these categories of terrain.
Yeah, because if it was a regular ruin, you could move over it and stop on it and, everything like that. But buildings, you're not allowed to do any of that with if it's a purchased piece of, fortification that a player has bought.
Now, those are the categories. And as we talked about, area terrain is probably going to be the most used. Hills are there for color to kind of restrict movement, meaning you have to move up them, but you still move normally over them. And buildings are things you purchase, and obstacles are a little bit different, but they also have traits.
Did you notice the change in rules for what we know as area terrain from 8th to 9th?
What is it?
The wording of it is that infantry, beast, and swarm models receive the benefit of cover while they're within it. So now it's model by model. It's not entire unit.
Oh, yeah.
So we're getting in our DeLorean going 88 miles per hour back to 7th edition, where cover was based on the model and not on the unit. So now you get to kind of identify which model is taking a save, and you could say, and you can roll for those models that are in cover for their +1 save, or whatever benefit they get for whatever terrain feature they're in, until you start taking saves on models that do not have that benefit. Yeah. So it's a big change.
Yeah, and what's interesting? It says within it, not wholly within it. So in other words, it just has to be touching it. And they haven't quite defined this yet, because in 8th edition, the shorthand is the vehicle is literally touching the side of a wall. It is quote unquote within, that terrain, that ruin. Area terrain is basically a footprint at ground level. So I still think there's a question here, is that let's say you have a ruin and it's just a flat wall against a mat. If you have a string of infantry models on one side of the ruin and it's touching the wall, are they getting, the benefit of those terrain traits? Or do they have to does the lip of their base have to be over the footprint, within the footprint? I kind of argue that you probably want to have them, the lip of the base has to be over it, not just touching the side of it. I know we're getting really brass tacks here, but it's kind of important, because that's what we used to do with vehicles a lot with last edition.
Well, and if I was a TO, I would agree with you, Mark, is that the vehicle would have to be, at least toe in the footprint of that thing, not just, touching a wall like you're 6 years old playing tag again and you're touching base,
It was a shorthand thing we did last edition. And I don't know if there's a clear answer for that. I think it's probably a TO thing, but I think that really, a reasonable case we made is to be within area terrain is to be over area terrain at the ground level. So, All right. So terrain traits. The first one is defensible, and this is a bonus to infantry being charged. So essentially, a defensible piece of terrain is an infantry units can hold steady or set to defend. So a defensible piece of terrain is, I'm an infantry unit, not beasts or swarms. I'm infantry. I'm in a piece of area terrain, so only area terrain can get the defensible trait. If a unit goes to charge me, I can do one of two things. I can hold steady, which means my Overwatch attacks hit on 5, or I can set to defend, which means I don't fire Overwatch, but I get +1 to my hit rolls in the next fight phase. So in basically the upcoming fight phase, because we're talking the charge phase is when you would declare whether you're hold steady or set to defend. So it's actually pretty good, because essentially, in the past, if you had a unit inside, the ground floor of a ruin and a unit on the other side of the wall charged, you couldn't see, so you couldn't Overwatch anyways, because you have to be able to see what you can shoot. This case, you at least have the option to set to defend if you can't actually make an Overwatch attack. If you choose to make an Overwatch attack, you're hitting on 5, which I'm sure I'm going to forget a lot, but I think defensible is one of those rules that you're going to have to play around with. And this is also one of those things where infantry units do pretty well in this edition because of this.
And you cannot fire Overwatch, right, when you set to defend, like, period.
Yeah, it's one or the other.
Yeah. So aren't you so happy that they didn't put on there that you get +1 to Overwatch? They put you hit on 5s instead of,
Yes.
Because then Tau would be hitting on 4s in Overwatch, and then nobody would be having fun. Yes,
that's a good point. That is a good point. It doesn't say +1; it just says hit on 5s. So that's good. So that's defensible terrain. Which, I mean, if you have an infantry unit, oftentimes, if I have an infantry unit, and I'm charging another infantry unit behind a wall, and it's defensible, and they can't see to shoot Overwatch, or maybe they can see, but they decide not to shoot Overwatch. So they go, I'm going to set to defend. If I charge that unit had better be something I'm pretty sure I'm going to do a lot of damage to, because they're going to get a +1 to hit when they swing back on me. So you can't really charge a unit of kind of equal. You got to be pretty convinced you're going to do some damage there, because the +1 to swing back, or that unit you're charging has to be really weak in combat. And you're not worried about the +1, but +1 could be a big deal for some armies. Or some units.
Imagine charging like a big unit of Bulgrin that's in terrain or something. That would just be like, that'd be a death sentence for pretty much anything. Like, God, like even charging it with like Morty or something like that. Oh, boy.
Yeah, because if you don't kill them, which, they're pretty tough, yeah, that's brutal. So I like it. I like the set to defend. That's good. Defense line. If an enemy unit was within 1 inch of this terrain feature, you can still make a charge move against it, so long as that charging unit ends its charge move touching that terrain feature and is within 2 inches of the target unit. This is different. So the defense line basically means that you kind of have you can make a charge and touch the terrain. You can fight if the enemy is within 2 inches of it on the other side. So the only real example that you see that they've provided for a defense line are those little small kill team ruined walls. A defense line is essentially giving you an extra inch to reach out, basically an extra inch to your engagement range for those units that are sort of touching the terrain feature.
The only reason I can think they added this is that there are some defense lines or some things that could be identified as defense lines that they are about an inch tall or just over an inch tall.
Yeah.
And per, rules is written, if that thing is just over an inch, you're not able to get within an inch, which means you're not able to ever technically assault that thing.
Yeah, that makes sense, because because if they're fat enough, or they have the weird, like the actual defense line, that fortress, that network, that the Imperial network, it might just be over an inch because it looks kind of cool to have that big, thick barrier. But then again, with engagement range being defined as an inch, then it makes sense that it's like, well, you get an extra inch because you're touching it. So it's almost like they looked at all their terrain and were like, oh, okay, wait a minute, we got to do something about this one particular thing here. So now they have this thing called a defense line. So next is Breachable, and Breachable and Scalable, basically, we can kind of talk about it at the same time, but Breachable is infantry, beasts, and swarms can move through walls, chains, or foliage. So Breachable means you can go through a wall. So think of, basically, we had this in the last edition, you're essentially moving through the terrain feature without any kind of impediment. So a ruin that is breachable, for example, infantry, beasts, and swarms can move through the whole thing. So they don't actually have to move around it. So this means that those 3 unit types can essentially traverse the battlefield. If all the terrain is breachable, then they have no problems just moving through everything. They don't have to go around it. So vehicles still have to, monsters still have to, Titanikians still have to. That has not changed. So breachables,
bikes have to, which was always a big one, but it makes sense. I mean, it was always kind of one of those things that held bikes back a little bit, that they had to move like a vehicle or a monster, but they were a small profile like infantry, but couldn't go through wall. It's always been that weird middle ground.
Yeah. And then of course, if it has fly, essentially it goes up and over, and it also does kind of ignores it, but they don't have to spell that out as a rule here. It just says the infantry beast swarms are breachable. They can move through walls.
Yeah, they don't care.
Yeah, girders, chains, and foliage I think is my favorite thing, because that is those. When is that type of terrain? It's the AdMech. It's the night terrain. It's the AdMech-y terrain.
Forge.
Yeah,
the forge where you can like upgrade their weapons or something like that. Or
yeah, but it's got ladders. It's got these chains that hang down. Essentially, it means that all of that you can move through it.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah. Then there's a difficult ground. Difficult ground is subtracting 2 and making a normal move, advance, fallback, or charge unless the unit can fly. So difficult ground is kind of what we had last time, which were craters, essentially. Craters and woods are basically difficult ground. So
aren't you so glad they didn't bring back dangerous terrain?
Oh, man.
In 7th, where when you landed in it, you had to roll, and on a 1, that model like just died.
I hated that rule so much. It was just the bane of my existence. It was terrible. Because like if you had like a unit of like anything that landed in it, you'd have to take a dangerous terrain check or be immobilized. I mean, or die. I'm so glad that does not exist anymore. That was my favorite change of this edition because it means that you can still kind of move a little more freely around the board. Last edition, unless you were super fast, you were kind of stuck. So, dense cover. Dense cover is area terrain or obstacles has to be 3 inches in height. So it has to be at least 3 inches in height. Dense cover's a little different. This is definitely new. All right, this is something that is new that we didn't have before. But it has to be 3 inches tall. And you subtract 1 from the hit rolls made. I'm going to quote this here. If you can draw a straight line, 1 millimeter in thickness. How they became 1 millimeter, I don't know, but you draw a straight line 1 millimeter in thickness. If you can draw a straight line 1 millimeter in thickness, and it passes through any part of that terrain to at least one part of the model's base, then you get the benefit of dense cover. So this is different than obscuring, which we'll talk about in a second. But you have to be able to, if you're targeting a unit, some small part of that base is obscured, that line passes over that terrain feature, then it is considered to be in dense cover. So this is a little tricky. By the way, models that have more than 18 wounds or are aircraft basically don't get this. So
sorry, Magnus. Sorry, Stinkerbell.
Yeah. So dense cover is meant for things like woods. But if the model is, if your unit that is attacking is actually on the terrain feature, then the unit on the other side of that does not get the benefit of dense cover. So
remember those industrial walkways that you were talking about, industrial structures? I mean, sounds like those things also might be sort of a dense cover type situation. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they define everything.
Yep, yeah, for sure. So dense cover, essentially with the -1 to hit, it's kind of a big deal. So you get dense cover regardless of the unit type. Vehicles, monsters will actually get it as long as they have less than 18 wounds and they're not an aircraft. So if that vehicle or monster is on the other side of a terrain feature that has a dense cover rule, they're going to be a -1 to hit. This actually has a pretty big impact on the game, depending on if you're using dense cover or not. Because dense cover, a -1 to hit is nothing to sneeze at. And of course, I mean, granted, it's capped at it, but a -1 to hit is still a big deal. You get dense cover even if you are not on dense cover. So you just need to be on the other side of it. So the vehicle or monster or infantry or whatever that model is, it doesn't actually have to be in the woods. It just has to be on the other side of it. If you draw a straight line from one unit to any part of model base and it goes over that piece of terrain, it's going to get the -1. So small walls also are kind of considered as an example of dense cover. The only way to get around that is to park yourself inside that woods. And so let's say I have a vehicle and I'm shooting at a squad on the other side. I have a wave serpent. And there's between me and a unit of Marines, there's a area terrain feature. And it has dense cover. If I move my vehicle into dense cover, then the unit on the other side does not get the dense cover rule because you're actually in it. So if you're on the dense cover or basically on the other side of it, then once you touch it, then they don't get the dense cover anymore because you're sort of in the dense cover. So yes, so this one is going to be a trick. And I think it's one of those things that I have seen some playtesting done. Most people don't have woods. Woods are such an annoying piece of terrain to build. Usually you have these little trees and they get knocked around and they start to fall apart. And but I think that you kind of need them for the game. I think it's going to be super useful to maybe you have some firing lanes, but you have a industrial structure or a piece of woods or something that gives you the -1 to hit. I think it's going to be pretty critical to really helping some units survive this game.
Woods weren't a functional thing until now. I mean, now they have rules associated with them that make them functional. So we might see more of them now.
Yeah, because before it was easy just to say, well, all right, the only thing woods give you is a -2, so we'll just do a crater because a crater is easy to do. But now I think woods or structures that are like woods, I'd like to have at least 2 of those on a table. I think that is enough to sort of really help sort of shut down a little bit of the firepower of this edition and blunt some of the alpha strikes. So we'll see. We'll see how that works out the best. But dense cover is kind of the big one, I think, is the big change of all these rules.
I would say it's the second biggest change. Like either one or 1A.
Yeah. We'll get to the biggest one here.
Yeah. In a minute, I don't know. That's my opinion. I mean, I could see the argument that dense cover would be the biggest one. But
sure. Well, it's the most different. We'll see if people use it. I think people should, but yeah, I think you should have at least one or probably two pieces of dense cover, but we're still playing around locally to find out what the optimal thing will be.
Yeah. And keeping in mind that, since a majority of, players now at whatever you play at, whether it's 1500 or 1750 or 2000 points, going to be playing on a smaller board, slightly smaller. So what we're probably going to see is there's going to be more dense terrain now, because the terrain that a lot of these game stores have and a lot of these tournaments have is the terrain they have. So now they have less board to cover. We're going to get more terrain per board.
Yeah.
So these rules are going to come into play even more often.
Yeah, for sure. Next, we have unstable position, which basically means models cannot be set up or move an end or end a move on top. So fuel pipes or statues, kind of a no duh. If you really want to really enforce the fact that people can't land on something, you just say, well, that has unstable position. So there you go. Exposed position, there's no cover if you're on top of it. So a container, the containers or certain debris, battlefield debris, the containers are kind of the classic, the shipping container that GW has and a lot of the third-party terrain manufacturers have. If you're standing on top of it, you can give it the rule of exposed position. There's no cover benefit if you're standing on top, which makes sense. Like you're kind of on top of the dang thing. So, but yeah. Obscuring. This is the other one. So it has to be at least 5 inches in height. And models cannot see through or over this terrain feature. A model is not visible if you cannot draw the 1 millimeter line between models without passing over the terrain feature. Essentially what this means is that this terrain feature, the entire profile of this terrain feature is one giant line of sight blocking piece of terrain. It has the obscuring rule if you're on the other side of it.
And this is what I would argue is the biggest one, because we've been dancing around this one for a while. If anybody played ITC, they knew that there was kind of, ITC didn't have many rules that they kind of injected into 40K to make it a more functional game. But one of the one rule that they did have really was that first floor of buildings is blocked out. Even though if you could see through it, the first floor was blocked out. You couldn't shoot through it from either side. You couldn't shoot out of it. You couldn't shoot into it. Done. I think this obscuring kind of takes that and ramps it up a couple notches, because even if there is a piece of terrain that has the obscuring characteristic, and even if it has a million windows, even if it is the pyramid on top of the Louvre, it's pure glass, you cannot shoot through that thing. If there is something on the other side of it. Now, if there is an enemy unit inside that glass pyramid, that is free. That is fair game. You can shoot at that. You can shoot at that thing inside that glass pyramid. But if they're standing outside of it, hint, hint. If they're standing outside of it, they can. You cannot shoot at them. So this is going to be a big change.
Yeah, and usually, ruins are the classic obscuring terrain. They'll have the ones, the examples they provide. Ruins have obscured terrain trait. Then usually it's either dense cover or obscuring. And obscuring essentially it's a line of sight blocker, the entire thing. So those classic GW ruins that you talked about, the manufactorum or the administrative building or whatever it was, which kind of have they sort of peak at the top. They start kind of fat at the bottom. They have a kind of a triangle shape. Well, that entire profile now is a line of sight blocker. But the thing is, if you have a unit that's in it, then you can still see it like normal, but you still have to use the same line of sight blocking or the line of sight rules. So a lot of the ITC terrain, for last edition, we took a lot of that terrain and we blocked off the first floor because we thought that, otherwise it was shooting gallery. So a lot of, stores and TOs and even people at home, they would put things to block off the first floor ruin windows, because they wanted to mimic this feature here. Now the entire thing is obscuring unless you're in it. So it's almost like I would rather have the windows open now. So if you're on the other side of it, it's obscuring, but as soon as you jump in it, then they can see you. And I kind of feel that's a little more thematic. It makes more sense.
Yeah, so, I would agree. I could see it either way.
Yeah, either way. But now if you're in a classic piece of ITC terrain, if you're on the second floor, then obviously it does not block line of sight. Because that would be super unfair because they could shoot you and you couldn't shoot them. So now as you shoot back and forth if you can see them in the terrain. But if you're not on it or you're on the other side of it, it's obscuring. So there's light cover, and usually it's on area terrain or within 3 inches of an obstacle. Light cover is you get 1+1 save against ranged weapons. So ruins usually have obscured and light cover, but if you're within it and it's either area terrain or, like I said, within 3 inches of an obstacle, you'll get the +1 save. So ruins, armored containers, craters, woods, imperial statues, blah, blah, blah. If the unit can be on it and receive the benefit of cover, then that benefit, in this case, would be defined as light cover, which is +1 saving throw. So, yeah. But going back though, I mean, area terrain, remember that infantry, beasts, and swarms receive the benefit of cover. Vehicles and monsters do not. So even if something is area terrain and has light cover, that doesn't mean a vehicle is going to get a +1 save to it. So that's kind of important to remember. Light cover is a thing, but you still have to follow the actual category of terrain. In this case, area terrain, which means a vehicle or a monster doesn't get the benefit of light cover. So. Yeah, and there will be. This is 40K. There's always going to be an exception to the rule. I mean, always for sure. For sure.
There's still going to be things like Raven Guard that I would imagine Raven Guard dreadnoughts and Raven Guard vehicles get the benefit of cover still.
Because it's part of their
chapter tactic. Yep. But. It really changes things if vehicles and monsters can't get cover saves like that.
Yeah, for sure. Then you have heavy cover, and heavy cover. First I was reading this, I'm like, oh my gosh, is it +2? No, heavy cover is +1 saving throws against melee weapons, unless the model has made a charge move this turn. So invulnerable saves are unaffected. This is the one that people had some questions about, but essentially. The intent here is pretty clear, is that if a unit is charging, they do not get the benefit of cover. But if you're the unit that got charged, you didn't make a charge move, you're going to get a +1 save in melee. So, yeah, which is good. Barricades, fuel pipes, those kinds of things usually provide heavy cover. Then finally, there's the inspiring, which is, before we go there's scalable, which is a lot like Breachable. Infantry, beasts, and swarms, and models with fly can move up and down the floors. So this excludes the ground floor. So you can actually move, obviously, a vehicle or a monster into the ground floor. But if you want to move up the terrain, up the floors, you have to be infantry, beasts, or swarms. And that's the scalable terrain trait. Now, you could have a terrain feature that's not scalable, in which case nothing can climb up it. So, I mean, if it doesn't have the rule, then they're not moving up. That's something you have to be very careful about, is when you start to define terrain, you have to give it the rules that you think it needs. And most ruins or armored containers or industrial structures would have scalable. Otherwise, pretty much you can't move up and down it.
Yeah, what fun would that be, though, if nothing's scalable?
Yeah, everything should be. I agree. Then there's inspiring. It's +1 leadership, wholly within 6 inches. And so essentially you can define this as +1 leadership to Imperium models, or +1 leadership to Xenos or Eldar, or however you want to do it. But this one I don't see coming up very often, except in like Crusade games or some more fun narrative types of things.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the terrain rule that will get forgotten the most often is, inspiring.
Yep, for sure. I think it's one thing to point out too, is that if you have multiple pieces of terrain, I'm going to give you an example. Let's say that you are shooting over or through a dense cover, like a forest, into a unit that is sitting inside a ruin, which is getting the benefit of light cover. That unit that's sitting inside that ruin would actually get the benefit of both, because they've split them up. So they'd be -1 to hit, +1 to save. Because they're shooting through, let's say, a forest, for example, that has a dense cover rule, into a unit that is sitting inside of a piece of terrain, in this case ruins, which is getting the light cover rule. There's going to be interesting examples here where depending on the board layouts, I think the clever players are going to really try to stack some of these trait rules to get the most advantageous sort of positions for their units. So I think this is where things get a little bit interesting, and that's why having different kinds of traits, not having everything is a ruin or everything is this or that. I think this sort of thing is going to get interesting with this edition.
I think GW is going to do a really good job of defining their terrain and what their terrain counts as.
Oh yeah.
The X factor will be that third-party terrain that we see, scattered about. I have an ITC like Void Shield generator.
Sure.
What are the keywords that go with that type thing? It's like Calvin Ball. You're making up the rules as you go along, kind of thing. So I'll be interested to see how this is standardized outside of GW products, if that will ever happen.
I think for next Boise Cup, assuming the pandemic is under control by then, which would be, over a year, next June. We haven't set a date yet, but the next time we run a big event like that, when you talked about the fact that locally we have to test these things out, we've got a lot of testing to do. And in the meantime, with the way things are right now, especially where we're living, we're going to be doing a lot of garage hammer. Which is actually kind of fun because we can really figure some stuff out. But we got a lot of garage hammer to kind of figure out the best way to have functioning tables in this edition, and functioning, but still look good. And I think that's really the nice mix that we want to get to.
Yeah, and I'm not too worried about us and Boise Cup, because then Aaron does a really good job of putting cards on the table to kind of identify what's what. Remember his like Tau table? His Tau table looks really awesome, but there's gaps in the walls between all the turrets, all the Tau gun rigger turrets.
Yeah. And,
there's just a card on the table that says these gaps in the wall, you can't really see through them.
Yep.
One way or the other, but we'll just replace those cards with what each thing kind of, which terrain traits each one has, and it'll be easy. I know it sounds like it's going to take extra time, guys. It's extra steps, but think about how much time has been wasted in games, either before the game starts, of like identifying what each piece of terrain is with your opponent and agreeing on what that thing is, or having a spirited discussion, we'll call it, about what should count as what, or even worse, having a less than spirited discussion mid-game when you did not define terrain beforehand. I think net time-wise, this is going to save us all a whole lot of time.
Yep, for sure. All right, let's hear a word from our sponsor. Speaking of Trader A, Captain A or Trader A, Aaron Albert. Let's hear a word from our sponsor, TraderA.com. If you're like most Warhammer players, you own a ton of models. At one time, you had big plans for these models, but now they just kind of sit, gathering dust, unused and unloved. It's time to clean out your closet of shame. Visit TraderA.com and get cash for your used models. Trader A is run by Captain A, someone who's been in the community a long time and has done a lot to grow the hobby. He's also a personal friend of the show. Unopened boxes, models on a sprue, half-built models, primed, painted, even bits have value. The process is simple. Send him a list of what you have. He'll send you a quote. You pack it up, send in your stuff, and he'll get you cash. You can shop around, but you're going to find that Trader A gives you 40% more than the other guys. You want it quick? You want to get rid of it? Visit TraderA.com. Get cash to buy the stuff that you really want. TraderA.com. Sell your models and get your cash quick and easy. Okay, and we're back. So we talked about a lot of rules, and thankfully, the 40K rulebook describes some common terrain features. So ruins, for example, they are area terrain, which means they have a footprint. And the footprint really can be sort of defined as the physical, there's a ground floor boundary the space it occupies. And I think most ruins are going to have some kind of defined area terrain, or you're going to have to sit down with your opponent and say, okay, point to point, this triangle, this is the area terrain limits of it. But it's area terrain. The traits are scalable and breachable, meaning infantry, beasts, and swarms can go up, down, or through it. It provides light cover, so that when you're within it, you get a +1 save. It's defensible, meaning you can set to defend or +1 you're over. So you can either get a +1 to hit in fighting phase, or you can overwatch on 5s. And it's obscuring, so that if you have a unit that's on the opposite side of it, it actually is a line of sight blocker, regardless of how many windows or whatever things it has. So that's the most common. Most tables are probably going to have 2 to 3 ruins, and that's typically what you're going to see on most tables. Sometimes up to 4.
Yeah.
The second is craters. It's area terrain, light cover, difficult ground, and that's it. And that's kind of just clean, right? And that's kind of really what it was before.
That's what it was before.
Yeah. Then you have the armored containers, or whatever the crates. Those are obstacles. Obstacles is a little different than area terrain. It provides light cover. It's scalable, but it is an exposed position. So because it's an obstacle, infantry, beasts, and swarms actually get the benefit of light cover if they're within 3 inches of it. So that's something to kind of remember, which I know a lot of people are going to start forgetting. They're used to treating these things as just kind of a save, but they're an obstacle, so they have specific features around it. And that benefit of cover that it provides is a +1 save. And you can climb up it, but once you're on top of it, your exposed position means that you're not going to get the benefit of the cover at that point. Mm-hmm. So, and then, there's woods is exactly what you'd kind of think. It's area terrain. It's dense cover, meaning if you're shooting through woods, you're going to get a -1 to hit. It's breachable. It's kind of funny. Breachable, meaning you can actually go through it. Yeah. It's defensible, and it's difficult ground, much like a crater. The one thing, the industrial structure, which is
the walkways.
The walkways thing, yeah. The industrial structure. It's area terrain. It's scalable, breachable, dense cover, and defensible. And that's kind of what's interesting about it, is that it's breachable, meaning you can go through it. But if you look at that walkway, that huge like furnace-looking thing, there's this massive like boilerplate in the middle. And breachable, meaning you kind of have to define, I guess you can actually move through it, right? You can be inside that thing because there is a door there, because breachable is a term. So infantry can basically move through that stuff. And it provides dense cover, so if you're shooting through it, it's -1 to hit, and it's defensible.
And there's ladders all over those walkways. Whether or not the person puts them on them is another thing, but that thing comes with a lot of ladders.
Yep, for sure. And then, the thing they don't have on here is magic boxes. So they don't have, the Frontline would call it the enclosed ruin rule. Most of us affectionately refer to them as magic boxes. There's nothing, GW doesn't sell a kit like that at all. So how are we going to define that? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I feel like it's just a ruin with stuff you can move through, but
I mean, it'll be a ruin with, a ruin that probably provides light cover, and it's usually blocks all line of sight. I don't know if it's definitely defensible, but that's going to be up to the tournament organizer to identify if it's defensible or not. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like how are these third party companies or these tournament organizers going to keyword their tables?
For sure. So we will see, and I imagine that Frontline Gaming will come out with kind of some rules for some of their pieces of terrain whenever this drops. But right now, no one's playing any events anyways. So we're all figuring it out in the comforts of our garage, which I don't mind. And when we figured out some optimal ways to set up tables and some different themes, we'll have another episode on the different kinds of tables you can play with. And when you kind of use these rules to create both the thematic table, but that is also functional. So we'll have another episode on this. We've got to figure it out ourselves. But in the meantime, when you get your new edition of 40K, definitely go through these rules and think about the terrain at your store, think about the terrain in your house, and how would you define them? GW has some examples they provide, but you can get really creative with some of this stuff. Some of it may really have a negative play experience though, so you're gonna have to test this stuff out.
And I think, I've seen on Facebook there's already some cheat sheet terrain cards making the rounds, which it's not the worst idea to be walking around with a cheat sheet for these things, because it is a big add to rules that we didn't have in the last edition, and it might take us a little while to get used to all this.
Yeah, for sure. But I think it's something we wanted and we asked for, and I don't know if we begged, but it may have felt like it at times. They have provided it with this edition, which I'm really grateful for. So we will see the best way to do them, but I'm glad they gave us the rules. It's kind of up to us to figure out the best way to run these things.
Yeah, we were the have-nots the last couple editions, and now we are the haves with all the terrain rules, and we'll see which world we would have rather live in. I'm tending to side on the have side of having more terrain rules.
For sure. All right, that is all we have for terrain in the new edition of 40K. Thank you so much for listening to our show. We love to hear from our listeners, so please feel free to message us on Facebook or email us at thebattlehosts@gmail.com. If you'd like to support us, you can help us in a few different ways. You can tell your friends about us. You can like us on Facebook. You can subscribe to us on YouTube, and you can leave a review on iTunes, which does help to boost our listening audience. Finally, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thebattlehosts. For as little as $1 a month, you can help us with the cost of running the show and staying engaged with the 40K community. So thank you for listening to Battle Hosts.
Remember to be a better gamer
and build a better community. Good night.